Als erstes möchte ich Ihnen gerne noch die Panelisten vorstellen. Wir haben ja ein sehr hochstehendes Panel zusammengestellt. Als erstes natürlich der Autor, Professor Daniel Jona Goldhagen. Er ist Politikwissenschaftler und arbeitet vor allem über den Holocaust und Völkermord. Er hat 1996 das Buch Hitler's Willing Executioners veröffentlicht, das im Film, den wir gesehen haben, auch erwähnt wurde. Und das Buch Worse Than War, was diesem Film zugrunde lag, ist von 2009. Die zweite Panelistin, Professorin Paola Gaeta, ist leider wegen eines Todesfalls jetzt nicht gekommen. Ich darf Ihnen aber dann vorstellen, Professor Nicolas Michel. Er ist Völkerrechtsprofessor an der Uni Genf und am Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies in Genf. Er war von 1998 bis 2003 der Direktor des schweizerischen, der Völkerrechtsdirektion im eidgenössischen Departement des Äußeren. Und er hat unter anderem auch die schweizerische Delegation für die Treffen der Vorbereitungskommission und der ersten Staatenversammlung für das Römerstatut des Internationalen Strafgerichtshofs geleitet. Im Jahr 2004 hat der UN-Generalsekretär Kofi Annan Professor Michel als Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs and United Nations Legal Council ernannt, und diese Position hatte Professor Michel bis 2008 inne. Und seine gegenwärtigen Forschungsgebiete schließen ein internationale Organisationen, internationales Strafrecht und auch das Prinzip der Responsibility to Protect. Der nächste Panelist ist Professor Dr. h.c. Christian Tomuschat. Er ist emeritierter Professor für Völkerrecht und Europarecht von der Humboldt-Universität Berlin. Er hat neben seiner Lehrtätigkeit zahlreiche Posten in internationalen Organisationen und an Gerichten innegehabt, unter anderem bei der Völkerrechtskommission der Vereinten Nationen, im Menschenrechtsausschuss der Vereinten Nationen und in Schiedsgerichten. Von 1997 bis 1999 war er der Vorsitzende der historischen Kommission, Untersuchungskommission, die den Völkermord und Menschenrechtsverletzungen während des guatemaltekischen Bürgerkriegs zwischen 1962 und 1996 untersucht hat. Und er war auch Rechtsvertreter in zahlreichen Verfahren vor internationalen Gerichten. Und schließlich möchte ich Ihnen noch Botschafter Dr. Jürg Lindenmann vorstellen. Er ist tätig am EDA seit 1999 und er ist jetzt der stellvertretende Direktor der Völkerrechtsabteilung und Leiter der Division 1 zu Menschenrechten, humanitärem Völkerrecht, Recht der Diplomatie und Terrorismusbekämpfung. Und er ist langjähriger Verhandlungsführer für die Schweiz in Bezug auf zahlreiche internationale Abkommen, insbesondere auch bei den Vertragsstaatenversammlungen des Römerstatuts für den Internationalen Strafgerichtshof. Und er lehrt auch Völkerstrafrecht und Völkerrecht an den Universitäten Fribourg und Luzern und Bern. Ich möchte jetzt als erstes unsere Teilnehmer bitten, in einem ganz kurzen Statement erste Eindrücke zum Film, den wir gesehen haben, zu machen. In English or French or German. Mainly English, I think. I'll go in the order, but Jona Goldhagen will go last. So, Nicolas, Michel, you have the word.
Vielen Dank, Anne. Ich glaube, dass es wahrscheinlich einfacher ist, wenn ich wie andere Panelmitglieder auch Englisch spreche. Da ich nicht Englisch spreche, sondern Fränglisch, meine Sprache wird leichter zu verstehen sein. I mean, after what we saw, I think that most of us are under kind of a shock, and it's probably what was intended. So I'm not saying that I'm not shocked. Obviously, I'm not shocked at the film. I'm shocked at the reality behind the film. And this is, I think, a healthy shock. So it's kind of difficult now to react in a way that is as rational as possible without forgetting the emotions. I mean, one needs, of course, to take on board also this reality and the kind of emotional reaction that it prompts in us, but try to keep these emotions as healthy and keep them under control. So just a few words, because your expectation is we can then develop in the course of our exchanges. First of all, my reaction here, especially in front of a number of people from the young generation, is that genocide and mass atrocities are not a fatality. Is that not only action is required, but that we can do something. And not they can do something. The risk when one sees the film is to think that they are bad people, they made it wrong, and to think that each one of us put in the position to decide would have decided in the right way, in the proper way, and done the right thing. Or on the contrary, it's so massive what we're seeing that we might have the reflex we can't do anything about it. So definitely there is something that we can do with our own talents and personalities. Now, I definitely believe that it is worth trying, but what to do? But it definitely depends on who we are, where we are, the type of, every one of us has received talents. So what we are prepared to do and willing to do, first of all, to recognize the talents that we have received, and then how we want to give back what we have received. And in that context, I really do insist on the fact that, as simple as it may be, ideas matter. And I say that because when I used to be a student, I found it interesting to have professors of philosophy, other professors, telling us about ideas of different authors. And I used to think that ideas were just simply stimulating, interesting. But before being in charge of important responsibilities in different places, I never really realized how much ideas matter. And that we saw in the film in an impressive manner. And here, what I think, if I can convey this as a matter of personal testimony, what makes me move in terms of ideas that matter, without saying that I'm an example. I was in charge of heavy responsibilities, and looking back, sometimes I'm not sure that I made the right decision. I could not say that I'm sure that in the future, in each and every situation, I would take the high road and make the courageous decision. If you look at what you do with a critical distance, then you have to very honestly recognize that sometimes you may be, hopefully not exactly those who kill others, but these ordinary people who were, through different circumstances and difficult, led to be part of these horrendous things that happened. To me, what struck me in the film here, and which is close to really what makes me think and move and live, is that the most fundamental idea is the dignity of the human being. One of the people you interviewed, a former Nazi, said that in fact we forgot that in these persons there were human beings. In fact, that these people were human beings. So the ultimate cause is the loss of the sense of human dignity. And what to do today, if we have more time, I think there are many, many things to do. But with respect to what I have experienced in my professional life, there are two main trends today that deserve full attention. The one is the notion and the implementation of the notion of the responsibility to protect. And I was, in a way, associated with the way this notion was adopted, consecrated at the level of the United Nations, and I was to some extent associated with efforts aiming at putting it into effect. The second one of these main trends is the trend towards ending impunity, in other terms, criminal accountability. And here, enormous things have happened over the past 20 years, and I do hope that we will speak about it in the course of our exchanges. But as a lawyer, I wouldn't be complete, and I cannot, but if I did not mention at least how much I think about the importance of law, of the rule of law at large, of international law. One could be cynical after what we have seen here about the effectiveness of law and jump to conclusion that law is ineffective. And definitely that's not my view, and I think that we might need to discuss more about, despite the deficiencies, about the central role of an international order grounded on law. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicola. Christian Tomuschat.
Thank you very much. Well, this is really a moving film, and it, for me, it evokes many memories. In particular, all the pictures about Guatemala. I know many of the actors who appeared in the film. My colleague Otilia Luche de Coty, with whom I worked as a commissioner of the Truth Commission in Guatemala, and Kate Doyle of the National Security Archive, with whom I worked many times. Let me first of all tell you about a little story about personal memories. When I was a little boy during World War II, I was with my grandmother in Ludwigsburg near Stuttgart. And one day, well, I was 8 years old to be more precise. One day, other boys told us, there is a film, a very interesting film, in the movie house a few hundred meters away. Go and see that film. What was it? It was a film about the liberation of a concentration camp. I don't know which concentration camp it was. It was free, nothing had to be paid, and the essential thing was every civil servant of the municipality of Ludwigsburg had to go and see that film, otherwise he or she would not have been re-employed. And we as boys of 8 years, we saw that, and I can tell you, the memories are still with me today. I know what I saw, and I think I don't recall many things which I saw at the age of 8 years, but that I recall vividly. For a German, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very sad and shameful part of our history. And I can say I'm of a younger generation, although I appear to be an old man now. But at that time, you know, of course, I was a boy, and still today I'm not able to understand what happened in the brains of those people who executed persons, fellow citizens, you know. The Jews were not somebody apart, you know, they were citizens of our country. They were national, they lived next door, and how can, from one day to the next, you can try to eliminate those people, push them away, and send them away to gas chambers? How could that happen? We don't know. For me, you know, it was a kind of also of rehabilitation of Germany when in 1990 I was requested by the UN Secretary General to work as a rapporteur for the human rights situation in Guatemala. Such a proposal had never been made to a German before. And I found this was something unbelievable almost, you know, that the German was entrusted with that task. And I did not hesitate to accept the function, and I was rapporteur on Guatemala for 3 years. And afterwards, after the conclusion of the definitive Treaty of Peace, I was requested to preside over the Truth Commission. Again, I did not hesitate. I accepted it easily, although it was a very hard task, and I was faced with many of those scenes, you know, digging out of bones somewhere in the countryside, those very sad widows standing there, and many histories. And when you read our report, you know, about what happened, about the periods of genocide in Guatemala, it's distressing. And in particular, what happened to women, let me emphasize that from the very outside, the strategy of sexual assault on women was one of the worst parts of the so-called counterinsurgency strategies of the government of Guatemala. I agree with the preceding speaker. Something can be done, and I think this film is extremely important because it reminds us that we all have a responsibility. The international community has to do something. We as individuals, of course, we can do a little bit, but it is our government that must really assume that responsibility whenever there is a danger of genocide, and therefore I'm quite happy. I've always justified the intervention of NATO forces in Yugoslavia when there was a threat against the Kosovo Albanians. Some jurists are purists and said this was unlawful. I have never taken that viewpoint, and I have always maintained that whenever there is genocide, there is a right of the international community to intervene, even if the Security Council has not given an authorization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Jörg Lindenmann.
Thank you very much. I too, of course, I'm deeply impressed by the movie, by the personal accounts that have been given by the author and his father, and also by other victims of genocides over the globe. What I was also impressed was the accounts given by the perpetrators, by those who committed the genocides and how they or contributed to it and how they looked at it. Of course, the movie poses with force the underlying question: how come that the human being is capable of these acts of horrendous barbarity that are beyond imagination, when we know that the same human beings would otherwise be capable of building cathedrals, fly to the moon, compose symphonies or what have you. And that, of course, we're probably not going to solve on this panel tonight. But certainly the fact that we can dream of positive things is also that we can dream of the most horrendous things. And the question is how we refrain from going down the road of racist ideologies, and how we create and sustain, in a way, societies that are tolerant, are liberal, that where people, citizens, are respectful for each other. One of the main theses of the film is that genocides don't just happen, but that they are planned, ordered, designed, that they're part of politics. The Bosnian president says genocide is always politics, and I certainly subscribe to that. There are a couple of things that flow from that, and some of them may give us some hope that, in fact, there is something to do. One is that since genocides are planned, it needs a period of preparation for getting there. So it's not just something spontaneous that happens at 6:30 in the evening, but something that has a run-up. And so we have to be watchful and look for the signs that are out there before genocides happen. And of course, I think we have done much progress since the Rwandan genocide on that issue in terms of early warnings. What is it that we have to look at? Do we have to be watchful for? And then the other thing is, of course, not only to look, but then also to react. And how do we intervene early on, forcefully, first with diplomatic means and all other means that we have at disposal, and only when worst comes to worst and really there's nothing else, then we can think about using force. So the early warning issue and how to translate that into effective reaction, that is one issue. Another one that was also mentioned nicely in the film is that since the genocidaires are politicians, they make a rational cost-benefit calculation, and it is our duty to ensure that there is no benefit from committing genocide. And that's where where the tribunals, for me, come in, the International Criminal Court, and the system that it's created. It's not just the court out there, but the court is a center of gravity around the international criminal law system, where the national side is very important as well, and other actors. And I hope that we can get back to that. So if we can fight impunity effectively, if we can show the genocidaires that in fact they are going to be caught, and not like Rwanda, soyez nombreux, so you're not going to be caught. So be numerous, contribute all to the genocide, so you're going to be run away free. This is not what happened, and I think the international community has a duty, and it is, to some extent at least, taking this on board to prevent that perpetrators of these crimes run free. The last point, and that's where I may not entirely agree with the notion of the film. I would be more lenient, more generous with the UN. I wouldn't just want to throw it away and want to turn away from the UN and look for other institutions. I think the UN has an important role to play. It may be imperfect. That is true for basically every man-made institution. The UN is the global institution, and as such, it has a value, and we'll certainly discuss about that. The military intervention, again, I quickly hinted to that. It is an ultima ratio only, and we have to be very, very, very sure what the effects of a military intervention are, whether it actually brings the results that we hope for, whether we do not create more harm than that we would prevent. We also have to be sure that then, if there is a military intervention, that it's properly staffed, because otherwise you do, and trained and everything, and sometimes maybe it's just not possible. I don't know how you could have prevented the Rwanda genocide by a military intervention through the air. You would have had to staff the people who were there, and probably triple or make them 10 times as large. If at the time that they withdrew, I agree that maybe there would have been chances to intervene more forcefully before. But once the decision was taken to withdraw from Rwanda, I think a military intervention at that time would probably have been very difficult. But that is all to be debated. What my point here is, there is the number one revolution of the UN Charter is that states are not free to go to war anymore. They have delegated that competence to the Security Council, imperfect as that may be, but there is no free decision for any country to go at war anymore, and even for good motives. We may have good motives, but if we take the right for us to decide when and where to intervene with military force, then others with less noble intentions might do the same thing. And I think that Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter is a revolution, and I would not want to throw that away too easily. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jörg Lindemann. So now, Daniel, you can react to the responses.
Well, first of all, I'm very pleased to see so many of you here, particularly because, as the panelists have emphasized, the law matters a great deal. I'm quite a critic of international law, and I think for good reason, otherwise I wouldn't hold the positions I do. But it is one thing that I think we can all agree upon. It's much better to have better international law than less good international law, and much better to work to try to create law that would be effective in this area in saving people's lives, and then getting it to be followed by politicians. So we can certainly all agree on that point. I would just like to raise three topics to throw them open for discussion, and I raise them because I really want to hear, and I hope that you want to discuss these issues, because I think they're difficult issues and critical issues for moving forward with the main themes that we are addressing this evening. The first, let me say, is about Rwanda and what could have been done there. And we can have a long discussion about when intervention could have occurred, and so on and so forth. But the thing we critically have to keep in mind is that intervention or just saving lives is not an all or nothing proposition. If you intervene in Rwanda and you save only 10,000 people's lives, I mean, we get lost in the numbers here, but you save only 10,000 people, so they kill 790,000, terrible. But if you save 10,000 people's lives, it's an enormous historic achievement, and all those people are alive. Now, in fact, Dallaire, the general in charge of the UN forces, had a plan, even with minimal forces, to save a lot of people. He couldn't have saved everyone. This is what I alluded to with Madeleine Albright. I didn't lay it out. And his plan was to bring the Hutu, who were looking for shelter, into the stadium of Rwanda, of Kigali, and into central locations, and have UN troops, and there were Belgian troops on the ground as well, to protect them, to create really to protect them with force. And he asked for the permission to do it and for reinforcements, and it would not have taken many. They didn't. The Rwandans, the Hutu that is, had minimal military capacity. You didn't need many people on the ground to save a lot of people. And the UN pulled them out and forbade him from doing it and pulled the forces out, and the Belgians got out, and we know what happened. So even with the poor resources that were on the ground, and with maybe a few more who could have been parachuted in, they could have saved a lot of people's lives. So it's not an all or nothing proposition, and we tend to think dichotomously. We couldn't save everyone. What do you expect? Well, we don't have to save everyone. We can't intervene in every genocide. Well, it doesn't mean we can't intervene in some. If we stop one, it's already a great achievement. But people who don't want to do it, or people who aren't thinking this through carefully, speak in these dichotomous terms, all or nothing, and raise these kinds of objections. What we need to do in the face of these objections is say to everyone, the problem is not that we intervene too much. The problem is not that we're running around the globe and bombing everybody and intervening everywhere and we're going over, but the problem is we do almost nothing. So let's start doing something, and if we start doing too much, then we can deal with that problem when it occurs. Because the historical record is appalling. Second, I raised the issue of sovereignty in the film. Sovereignty is, you can tell me, the foundational principle, or certainly one of the foundational principles of the international order. Sovereignty today, Libya shows it, is utterly in tatters as a concept. It is a legal fiction, which people hold on to when it's convenient for them, and they dispense with when it's not convenient for them. But because it's a powerful legal fiction, it can provide a lot of cover for a lot of people, and it provides excuses for countries, Western countries, other countries, not to act against countries or regimes which are slaughtering their own people. The UN Charter, of course, does not permit aggressive war. That is true. But it doesn't have a lot to say about what happens when a regime is killing its own people within its own borders. And that's where you have to abridge sovereignty if you're going to intervene. So we need to talk about what a contemporary concept, a reconstituted concept of sovereignty should be in the 21st century, so that it helps provide the international stability that the concept and its respect and its legal support and political support has provided for the international system, but which does not allow regimes to slaughter people with impunity. We have to refashion the concept, and we need to think about what it should be. And third, we need to think more systematically about how to stop mass murder, eliminationism. The film was rather elliptical on these points, very quickly said a bunch of things, and I'm surprised I usually get attacked on this thing about bounties, and not that I like being attacked, but it's an important issue, and so I bring it up and open the floodgates for attacks on it. But before that happens, that is if it happens, we need to think about creating an international anti-genocidal or anti-eliminationist system, and put it in place. There is none today. Such a system would have three components: a justice system. We have the embryo of a justice system in the ICC, and the ICC should be applauded and furthered and strengthened, but it's certainly not enough. We need an intervention system so that when genocides begin, we can stop them. But we need a prevention system so they don't begin. And that's actually where we should focus our attention. because we don't want these things to begin in the first place. And if you have effective deterrence, which the ICC is beginning perhaps to create, but it's not sufficient to do it itself, if you have effective deterrence, it operates on every potential genocidal killer. You don't even have to know they're planning it. You don't have to wait for early warning signs, because they think, if they know that there is a deterrence system in place, that they will pay a substantial cost. They then think, do I want to go down this road? And even if they do, their subordinates think, do we want to be part of this, because we too will suffer? And so we need to have a discussion about how we can create a robust justice system, a robust intervention system, but I think most of all a prevention system, which is ultimately the most effective, the cheapest, and the most defensible, because if it's set in place, you don't have to do very much. The other two parts of the system require a great deal of action. Intervention is very hard to bring about. So I'd love to hear what the panelists and what all of you think about this, both from a legal perspective and a political perspective. Whether we can then get our political leaders to adopt any of these things is another difficult problem, but first we have to know what we want to do, or rather, what should be done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I think this is really a good start for our lawyers here on the panel. Refashioning sovereignty is the one thing, and setting up an effective anti-genocidal system, which you says is not in place, is the other thing. You even said in the film, I think that was your voice, saying that the UN Genocide Convention is totally inefficient and has never ever prevented one single genocide. So I would like to ask the panelists to react to these propositions: refashioning sovereignty and an anti-genocide system, a better system. And maybe we can do it one by one, and maybe, Nicola, you want to start on sovereignty and refashioning sovereignty?
You're so competent on that. In fact, these were some of the questions that you, expected to come. And the challenge for me is not to be too long on a question that I expected to come. But I think that a number of you apparently are interested in knowing more about this notion of the responsibility to protect that you heard of. So if you allow me, a few minutes, it's kind of a challenge, but I'm going to speak a little bit about it. So this new notion of the responsibility to protect was proposed to the United Nations by an international commission that had been set up upon the initiative of the Canadian government in 2000. For those interested, if you Google the responsibility to protect, you might find this report by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. Already the title is a clear indication. The title was not humanitarian intervention, and I think that I can say it here because one of those who was invited to be a member of the committee, the former president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, President Cornelio Sommaruga, said that if you use the expression humanitarian intervention, I'm not going to participate. And other members said, if there is not the notion of sovereignty in the title, I don't participate. So you already see the complexity, but this report was not elaborated upon the initiative of the UN, but an international commission, very well balanced with people coming from different countries and regions and cultures of the world. And why was it adopted? It was Secretary General Kofi Annan, who in 1999, the year of Kosovo, at the General Assembly in September, and again in September of 2000 on the occasion of the Millennium Summit, who told member states, if an intervention like the one in Kosovo is contrary to sovereignty, then tell us what we have to do when ethnic cleansing is happening. So the challenge was taken by the Canadians, who then came back with this notion of the international, of the responsibility to protect. Why? In Kosovo, where there was an intervention, there was a lot of criticism. It was wrong to intervene. But prior to that, in Rwanda, in Srebrenica, there was no intervention. It was wrong not to intervene. So both was wrong. So there was a need for a concept that would, answer the challenges. So the responsibility to protect notion was meant to replace the notion of humanitarian intervention that was criticized a lot because considered to be too much of an expression of the right of the powerful to militarily intervene where their interests were at stake. Was it right or not? But at least it was the way it was perceived sometimes and criticized. So what is the fundamental idea behind the notion? The fundamental idea is that there is a need to overcome the apparent contradiction or opposition between, on one hand, sovereignty and the other hand, intervention for the sake of protecting human rights and human lives. Because until then, people were saying sovereignty always prevails, but there are circumstances where it is lawful to disregard sovereignty. But this is not the approach of the report. The report is influenced by an idea of one person you saw on the screen talking to Daniel Goldhagen in the General Assembly Hall in New York, Francis Deng, who developed the concept of sovereignty as responsibility. That means that sovereignty is not only a shield against any intervention from the international legal order or international outside actors, but a state is not sovereign as long as it does not fully exert its own responsibility to protect its own population. So, sovereignty as responsibility. Now, in really very short 5 bullets, what are the main differences between responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention? First, the primary responsibility lies with the member state. It is not the international community that is responsible to intervene, but it's first and foremost the state that is responsible to protect its own population. And it's only if a state fails to protect its own population that, as a matter of subsidiarity, the international community also has a responsibility to intervene. Second, with humanitarian intervention, the focus is more on the right to intervene on the side of the intervention. With responsibility to protect, the focus is on the protection of victims, of affected people. So the perspective here is completely different. It's what the French, when they initiated this idea of droit d'ingérence, Mario Bettati and others developed. Third, humanitarian intervention refers mainly to military intervention. However, as Ambassador Linnemann said before, responsibility to protect, encompasses a number of other means, including coercive measures, but if possible, short of military action, military when really necessary, principle of proportionality. 4, humanitarian intervention is about reaction. However, the responsibility to protect has 4 pillars. 1 is prevention, 2nd, reaction, and 3rd, reconstruction. There is no lasting peace if there is no reconstruction. You don't establish a peace if you only cease fire. But first and foremost, prevention, as you said before, is of the essence. And the last point is that R2P was not responsibility to protect. I'm sorry, in the jargon, that's the way people refer to it. Responsibility to protect was not meant to be a substitute for the Security Council. The objective was to make the system of collective security of the UN work, not to find a substitute for the system of collective security. And this is where it was intended that the Security Council should honestly respect its responsibility under the Charter, mainly Article 24, principal responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security, and consider that the peace is at stake, even international peace is at stake, when human rights are massively abused internally, not necessarily internationally. And that's an essential element. So now, but there remains the question, what happens if in a horrible situation the Security Council fails to exert its own responsibility? And that's one of the weaknesses of the concept, because the central issue, the key issue here remains.
Thank you, Nicolas. Maybe Some of the two other panelists want to follow up on sovereignty and on this new concept, responsibility to protect, as it was applied in Libya, perhaps, although this is not a case of genocide, but of crimes against humanity. But maybe there is some merit in mentioning that also. Daniel also mentioned it. I don't know, Jörg or Christian? Whatever?
Well, I realize, that there is a big difference between the two concepts. On the one hand, humanitarian intervention. On the other hand, responsibility to protect. But nonetheless, the last question is always, will it be possible in an extreme situation to resort to military force? This is incontournable, as the French say, and the Security Council is not a very reliable institution. And we have just seen, in respect of Libya, that the Security Council can easily feel frustrated if a resolution which it adopts is extensively interpreted to such an extent that instead of protecting civilians, this degenerates into a general fight against a regime. And we now are witnessing that with regard to Syria, the Security Council is not moving ahead. It does not even like to criticize Syria because it is afraid that such a resolution might be used as a pretext by some nations to invade Syria. I think there's no danger of that, but that is the real crucial point, and therefore we cannot avoid whether there are the question whether there are situations where you have to proceed to a balancing. Is national sovereignty and territorial integrity the supreme good, and in international law? And I don't think this is the case. I think you really are entitled, also on the basis of the Charter of the United Nations, to proceed to such a balancing and saying, in particular, in the case of genocide, here the interests of the potential victims prevail, and a state cannot invoke its territorial integrity if it engages in grave criminal behavior. I think we cannot avoid that question, and many of my colleagues, who wrote very learned articles on the situation in Yugoslavia with regard to Kosovo, they said, well, under international law it was unlawful, but we think morally it was defensible. That is an easy outcome, but I think lawyers have a responsibility, and law is a system which is based on values, and one of the values is, of course, the human being, and it's not the state. The supreme good in international law is really the human being and not the state as such. And if a state really destroys the heart of international law, namely the individual with its rights and also with its duties, then the state forfeits its right to be respected as a sovereign entity on whose soil no foreign military force may be exercised. I think that's the crucial question which we cannot avoid, and this responsibility to protect concept is very good. And it indeed differs from humanitarian intervention. It has a different emphasis, but we come to the final point where we have to, admit openly that there is a crucial issue where we have to make a choice, and my choice is very clear. In the face of genocide, territorial integrity of the state cannot be invoked.
Clear. And now, Jörg Lindemann, I don't know, you can also speak about an efficient anti-genocide mechanism, or do you want to follow up on sovereignty?
Well, I don't want to follow up too long on sovereignty. I think I am more of the view of the report, R2P report, that to say basically that if the Security Council fails in the face of crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, that it then has not taken its responsibility. So I would probably be among those formalistic lawyers saying Kosovo was illegal but morally right, and I would take that into account with all that means, because the alternative is that the attacker, all the attackers that follow from then on, will say that they only intervened to defy a bigger evil, and that opens a Pandora's box, which I'm quite afraid of. But that is really, I think we should not focus too much on that, because that is to some extent a lawyer's discussion. I would like to open another parenthesis, though, in the same context, make a bit of pub for what Switzerland does in the Security Council. You know that we have an important project on the reform of the Security Council working methods, together with four other states, small states, so-called S5, as opposed to the P5, the permanent five. The small states are Liechtenstein, Costa Rica, Jordan, Singapore, and Switzerland, and we work on more transparency, more accountability for Security Council members, including the P5. And one of the things that we ask, and some people laugh about it, but I think it's pretty serious, that we asked Security Council members to consider not using the veto rights in the face of a developing genocide or crime against humanity. Already today, Security Council members, if they take recourse to a veto, they are under an obligation, sort of an obligation, or at least they do it. They give the reasons why they use the veto, and we would want to go one step further in asking them not to use it at all. So then some of the questions that we just asked would then maybe fall away if there's an overwhelming majority in the Security Council and only one or two states that would otherwise have a veto if they don't use it. So this is work in progress. We're far from there, but the discussion is serious with Security Council members. I would like to say some words on the international justice system, if I may, because we heard it is promising. It's an embryo. I would agree with that. It's terribly slow so far. I would agree with that as well. There are very little cases. It's not yet universal, but it is something that is going to be established and is going to be a success in a short time. I think we will see that. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court was adopted in 1998. It came into force in 2002. Today we have 119 states parties, so that's about a third. In terms of territories, it's not yet half the globe, because some of the big countries, big states, are not yet part of it. But it's moving along, and I think we have, if you're not there, we are close to the point of no return. It will become something universal, I'm pretty sure, because it's moving on in terms of numbers of ratification. The court now is considering 7 situations, the prosecutor investigating actively in 7 situations, that is 7 countries, all of them in Africa right now. It is slow, as has been said, because it's very complex. There are very little cases, because the prosecutor concentrates his strategies on the top leaders, and of course that is part of also what is asked for. If you want to show the design, the plan of a genocide, then you have to go after the top and not after the middle rank or lower rank. But that leaves then still a big problem that we have to fight. That is what we call the impunity gap. So if you have hundreds, thousands, like in Rwanda, of perpetrators, and you go only after 10 or 5, even in some situations, then the message that you are sending or might be sending is that it's okay to commit genocide as long as you don't make the mistake to be among the top 5 or top 10. And so along the lines of what we have invested, all the energy and all the money that we invest into International Criminal Court, we also have to invest into contributing to making the national authorities in the situation countries more effective. Or maybe we have to invest even more there than we do in the court. The court is a complementary system, I should add, so it only intervenes where and when states are unwilling or unable generally to prosecute the perpetrators themselves. That's when the court steps in. But that means that basically if we can establish all over the globe national justice systems that are effective, that then the ICC's role will be a very limited one. But we are very far from this, but we have to continue working on this.
Thank you. Daniel, do you want to say something? Or?
Just a few quick reactions. On this last point about the court targeting just the top leaders, and I certainly agree that they're the most important people to prosecute, but it is also, as was said, not nearly enough. And you need to go vigorously after the second-tier leaders, and I think that the international legal system should make it clear through legal statute that anyone participating in the government in cabinet-level position or high-level or high-ranking military or police position in a regime that is committing genocide is part of a grand international conspiracy, even if that person has not himself or herself contributed in any tangible way to the mass murder, whether by making decisions or transmitting decisions, let alone killing people. You need to make it clear to the people who are directly below the actual decision makers that their own participation in that regime, if a genocide or crimes against humanity, whatever the legal categories are that are relevant, that their participation in such a regime makes them part of an international criminal conspiracy. And so that even if the leader of a country or the leadership wants to take a decision to start slaughtering people, there will be very high level or likely very high level resistance to it. So that it's not, you can't just put forward such a policy unless you have a lot of people at very high levels supporting you. And so we have to think about how that can be done and bring those people quickly under the purview of the court. And this is how you begin to think to make a more effective prevention system based on the existence of a court. But the court itself, for all the good that it does, and I think I would just want to throw one caveat to what you said about it becoming universal, which I think is on the way to being there. There will be one holdout for a very long time, and that's the United States. It's extraordinarily unlikely the United States will join the court anytime in our lifetime. And for geopolitical reasons and for reasons of domestic politics, which will not change. And it's not a minor omission, but the United States quietly cooperates with the court, even if it isn't formally a part of it. So the whole system can be fudged as it has been and still operate tolerably well. The problem with the court and the problem with the existing system and the problem with using courts as the main element of deterrence is that there are huge numbers of people that need to be prosecuted after the fact. You don't want the killing to be done, but if it's done, then what do you do? There's no theory of justice, there is no operational way to carry out justice that can deal with these crimes afterwards. You have to make very selective decisions who to prosecute. Let me give you some numbers. In Rwanda, using a traditional form of justice, which has been heavily, heavily criticized by the international legal community, Human Rights Watch and so on and so forth, as being totally illegitimate. Basically, village councils, village courts where people just judge their neighbors, called gacaca. They have processed, using gacaca as the main institution of justice, 1.2 million people suspected of having participated in the genocide. 1.2 million people. They've acquitted 300,000 and convicted 900,000. Wow. What do? You can't put them in prison anyway. You have to create concentration camps. Rwanda has enormously few resources. The problem in Germany after the war was on a massive scale, and they very selectively. And many people don't know this. The German government, the West German government, continued to prosecute people starting in the late 50s and did a tolerably good job of prosecuting people at the command level of camps and killing units of various kinds, and the perpetrators who distinguished themselves as being even worse than the baseline perpetrators during the Holocaust and the killing of other people, not just of Jews. But most of the people, when it got home, went off scot-free. What do? Justice is important, but it's not the principle. It is a last-ditch, too-late mechanism for dealing with these crimes, and that's why we have to think about prevention. And so what I want to ask is the very tough, hard-headed question to anyone who says, look, we have to stick by the law. The law, you open a Pandora's box, and I understand these arguments, and we don't want to do that. Pandora's boxes are not to be opened, if that's what would actually take place. And so the question is, if Rwanda is about to happen tomorrow, if a genocide is going to begin and you have knowledge it's going to begin tomorrow, and they're going to slaughter and butcher, as you saw in the film and as you probably knew ahead of time, 800,000 people, men, women, and children, in the most brutal of ways, what would you be willing to do? Not as an international lawyer, which you can be, but if you were the decision maker, if you were the President of the United States, if you were the Chancellor of Germany, if you were the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and so on, or if you're a member of the European Union, what would you do? What would you say we should do? Should we threaten the leaders? Should we bomb them? Should we send in forces? Or should we say, no, I'm being a little perhaps unkind here, should we say, no, we should talk to them and tell them they shouldn't do it, and that they have a responsibility? And what do you do if you try that and it doesn't work and they kill 10,000 people on the first day? This is the reality of genocide. You know where I stand on this, and I'm interested to hear how many people would say, no, we have to abide by legal norms and the law as we understand it. We have to take these slow steps of R2P. They're very slow. And you go into, and let me just tell you, and this is not as necessarily determinative, but when you go to these countries, as you know I have, what people say again and again is, why did your country let us down? We were being slaughtered, and we thought you would come, and you did nothing. It's not determinative. The law constrains people, right? We don't let people take revenge on other people. We have the law to prevent that. The law is important. But what do? What do you tell these people as they're being slaughtered? This is the critical question. It's not the only thing. Genocides don't always happen like Rwanda. But they happen quickly and they kill a huge number of people before we can mobilize discussion and the Security Council and so on and so forth. So what do?
Could I? Well, indeed. Let me come back to the case of Guatemala. And you saw it in the film that terrible massacres were committed, which are documented in a 12-volume report. I have one of those volumes here where it is described in detail what genocidal actions were committed by the armed forces of Guatemala. Now, very unfortunately, Guatemala had one ally, which was the United States. And the United States was quite aware of what was going on in Guatemala. But there were reasons of foreign policy, of general policy, because the United States was afraid that Guatemala might become a second Cuba. And for them, this was a reason to support the Guatemalan military governments, one after the other, with very little reservations. We got some materials from their archives, but not very much. And what we got from their archives was just support. They supported, and it was a fight against left-leaning social movements, and even movements which, in our consideration, would be called social democratic parties and movements. You just had to say the word social justice, and then all of a sudden you were a subversivo, and a subversivo has to be eliminated. So it shows you, that all these situations in a specific country also related to the general game of foreign policy. It's never just in isolation. There is always a web of international connections according to which, and we know that regarding, human rights during the Cold War, there were those people who heavily criticized human rights violations in Eastern Europe, in all those socialist countries, but they never dared to criticize some human rights violations in the West. So there's always this general cobweb of political considerations. Now let me add another idea. This is, of course, prevention. How can you prevent that? And one of the recipes is, of course, and I think I was called onto the podium because I was supposed to say something on the Truth Commission in Guatemala, and this is also kind of remedy after a conflict. You try to establish a Truth Commission. This Truth Commission is supposed to look into the past and clarify what happened, the reasons, in the hope that once you know what triggered the genocide and other atrocities, this would not recur. This is a hope, that this is an assumption. And in all countries where there is a discussion on the establishment of a Truth Commission, there is an alternative which is vividly debated everywhere. There are those people who say, you need a Truth Commission. We need to know, because it's only on the basis of the truth that we can establish reconciliation. Un pueblo sin memoria es un pueblo sin paz. People without memories is a people without peace. And there are those others, and mostly, the military forces, the powerful people say, oh, don't let us go into the past. Let bygones be bygones. We have to look to the future. We have to rebuild the country. And why should we waste our time on going into all these wounds of the past? We should not reopen those wounds. And my personal conviction is that it's true. Reconciliation and peace can only be obtained on the basis of good knowledge of what happened, about the reasons and all that. In Guatemala, after we handed over our report to the government had a chance really to take this up and say we can make a fresh start now. This is now the past has been overcome. We have peace. We have a peace treaty, and now let's try to look into the social causes of the conflict. But this chance was wasted, and the powerful people in Guatemala had no real interest in initiating prosecution, in curing social ills, and improving the system of education. Poverty, there are so many reasons which may also explain the fact that such a terrible conflict erupted. But I think a Truth Commission is one of those instruments which are useful. They are not a panacea. They are not a panacea, but they can be helpful, in particular if the government concerned has a real will to change things.
Thank you. So unless the other two panelists want to say something urgently now, yes, and then I will afterwards open up for questions from the floor. Jörg Lindmann, and then.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. The problem with prevention is that you hardly see when it works. You only see when it does not work. Maybe just one intervention here is an anecdote that the then Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide, Juan Mendez, told me, and I think it's public, so that's why I can say it again. In Côte d'Ivoire is one of the countries that has accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC without ratifying it, but I don't get into it, but they accepted the jurisdiction of the court. And when, I don't know exactly what year, in 2005, 6 or around there, there was an outburst of violence, and in particular there was hate speech and hate speech is one of the indicators for a genocide, a very clear one. So some of the rulers used hate speech in public, and then Juan Mendez took the phone and called them and said, "You continue, and I guarantee you, you will be at the ICC next year." And they stopped. They stopped using hate speech, and it stopped actually the outburst of violence right there. So there are examples where prevention works, and if you get down to using force, then basically that means that you have failed in using a preventive diplomacy effectively, and that's where we try to work at most. Thank you.
Let me just quickly add one point to build on that. It's not entirely clear what happened in Kenya, why the violence stopped. My understanding of it is, and I can't say that I know this to be true, is that when it was Condoleezza Rice who brought the heavy hand, the big stick with her when she went to Kenya, and all she did was tell the leaders of the countries that if they continue to allow their people to fight and to kill and to expel other people, that they will have travel bans placed on them and their families, and they would be restricted in these kinds of ways. That was enough. It doesn't take a lot for in many of these countries to put this kind of pressure on them. But again, look, in Kenya, it was successful. You can look at Kenya as a success story or as a terrible failure. It stopped. Intervention, diplomatically, great. It's never happened that way before. But 300,000 people were driven from their homes and brutalized. A couple thousand people were killed. A total disaster. So we needed to have something in place so that it would have never begun in the first place, so that leaders would have known that they would have been called to account for sure. If all it takes is travel bans, then let's let it be that. But it takes more in many cases. So that's why prevention is critical.
Okay, thanks. Nicola?
I cannot not add something about Kenya, because if the prevention of mass atrocities only takes the threat of travel bans, it would be overly simple. No, definitely everyone knows that the key role there was played by the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, who spent a full month there with a team, with the support of states that had agreed on the unity of the mediation, not precisely to take individual action, because this would have disrupted the efficiency of the process. Now, four short things. First, on refashion the concept of sovereignty. I mean, it's more than that. Like Professor Tomushat said before, I think, even if he used other words, it's about refashioning the fundamental principles of the international legal order. If the Charter was adopted in 1945, with the first principle of sovereign equality, this was before the adoption of the International Declaration of Human Rights, before the 66 Covenants on Human Rights, before the Geneva Conventions on International Humanitarian Law, before the Rome Statute on International Criminal Law. All these elements are part of the constitutional elements of the international legal order, and this needs to be refashioned, and in that context, sovereignty. Next, put in place a system, you said. Yes, true, but make this existing system work will already be a huge achievement. It's about political will, as you said, much more than about a system functioning or not. The system could be efficient if there were a political will. Second, the ideas or self-interest of states, or what you wonderfully demonstrated, I really want to congratulate for that, is On one hand, the simplicity, on the other, the complexity of all the issues, including the personalities who are involved. Third, I didn't say, but since there are a number of students here, I must say that the concept of responsibility to protect was officially consecrated by the General Assembly in 2005. If you're interested in that, go to the document called 2005 World Summit Outcome. This is the 60th anniversary of the UN. On that occasion, the concept was adopted with the whole document by consensus, and that's a tremendous change in the international legal order, provided that it is really implemented. And more than that, the Security Council, a few months later, also in the abstract supported the idea, but what it did, we mentioned Libya, but we didn't say that the Security Council this year, twice in a row, it was in February and March, first time in February the 26th, by Resolution 1970, explicitly referred to the responsibility to protect, to decide to refer Libya to the International Criminal Court, but only a few weeks later, on 17 March, Resolution 1973, again, the responsibility to protect as a basis for a Chapter 7 resolution authorizing the use of military force. And again, for Côte d'Ivoire, a few weeks later, on the 30th of March, by Resolution 1975, except that the Security Council did not act. Well, I mean, there were 2 vetoes on the resolution on Syria. And the last one, very last, I apologize, but I think on ICC, and this is an enormous evolution in the international legal order. The young generation, please, realize that, because you were born in an international community where these tribunals did exist. It took an enormous effort to put them in place and to make them acceptable. So what is the future? The future here is not the International Criminal Court. It is the system that is put in place by the Rome Statute, meaning the International Criminal Court, but the primary responsibility of states to put in place efficient criminal mechanisms in a comprehensive way, meaning an International Criminal Court, plus national tribunals, possibly with international support, plus traditional means of criminal accountability where they exist, plus Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The whole complex needs to be put in place for these new elements to be efficient.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we now have the opportunity. You can ask questions. I will take maybe 4 or 5 questions in a row, and then the panelists can answer. Please stand up if you have a question. The microphone will be brought to you.
And the names should be given.
Yes, and say your name if you want. We'll take 4 to 5 questions.
Thank you very much.
And be brief.
My name is Jan Suter. What do I do? Unfortunately, I'm not a law student. I'm a historian, and that makes me kind of pessimistic. My question would be to Professor Goldhagen. You mentioned that some democratic states should take action in that system and go and intervene. I, as a Swiss, was kind of puzzled seeing the minarets in the pictures from Bosnia and reminding me that the democratic Swiss people voted that minarets are unconstitutional in Switzerland. So I'm kind of skeptic about democratic countries taking action. What would be the mechanism? Because we have a problem that is concerned with all the actions outside of the UN, and that is our son of a bitch has not to be attacked. So there was no intervention in Chechnya, and there won't be one in North Korea, and there won't be one in China, and there won't be one in the US in the case that they commit a genocide. So what would be your practical mechanism to implement a real good intervention system?
Thank you very much. We can take another question or remark. Here in the front is one. Daniel, somebody here. Stand up if you want to ask a question, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Henry Both from 4 Hours, from a young Swiss think tank on foreign policy. And I have a question about R2P, about the responsibility to protect. We discussed, and it was mentioned that now it is being implemented, and I want the panel to elaborate on this, because it was already mentioned today that it was invoked in Kenya in some way, in Cote d'Ivoire and Libya this year. And there are many analysts that say for what reasons, if not double standardness, it is not applied in Syria, it is not applied in Yemen, in Sri Lanka, in Bahrain, in Darfur, most of all. How do you explain? Is it really only about political will, or what can we do for the future, for the 21st century, to really find a system that is not only implied for some countries, where some countries have some interests, but for every country, to protect every people, and not just in some countries where maybe it is better to intervene, and in others it's better not to. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question or remark, there is one in the back, I think.
I have a question for Professor Goldhagen, and I want to know how you think that one single state can intervene in a genocide without coordinating with other states, and who's responsible for that decision if they think they, and when such a situation is taking place.
Thank you. We can take another question. Here, stand up, please, so that the microphone holders can see you.
Thank you. I have a question about the courts afterwards. How do you deal with people who are victims and murderers at the same time, which happens, for example, with child soldiers?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe one other, and then you'll respond. If there is none, we'll give the panel opportunity to respond. Daniel, do you want to go first?
Sure. I have no illusions that democratic states, particularly the United States, are paragons of virtue, and will simply implement universally defensible norms and principles and moral codes for acting in the international arena. I have no such illusions. Nevertheless, if any individual states or group of states are going to act in a way that we would support for the saving of lives, it will be the democratic states and not the non-democratic states that we have the most hope from. The reason to focus on them and to speak about them this way is because we want to shine the light on them. We want to make it clear that they have this responsibility, and we would like to ground it both morally and politically. And there are ways to say it's actually in their interest to do this. It's actually less costly to stop a genocide if they had done it in the former Yugoslavia than to pick up the pieces afterwards. It's a disaster, even for the non-intervening countries. And so we want to make it clear that it's their responsibility, morally, politically, and in every possible way that we can. The current system provides a fig leaf of do-nothingness for the democracies of the world, because they can say right now it's a Security Council issue. It's a UN issue. We can't act without their authorization, which we know is not true, but that's how they act, and that's what they say. And we should say, this is nonsense. That is assuming you think it's nonsense. We should say it's nonsense and say, no. If you, Barack Obama, stand by as the people in this country are slaughtering other people, this is on your historical ledger, as it should be said ever more loudly that it's on Bill Clinton's ledger, that he stood by as Rwanda happened. He made some bogus apology afterwards, which was at best a half-truth. And we should make it clear to them. I tell journalists all the time who interview me, I can say what I say, but you actually have a lot of influence. When you interview the secretary of the foreign ministers or the prime ministers or the defense ministers and so on of your country, you should say to them, why are you standing by and not doing anything? Turn it into an issue. Shine the light on them. Put pressure on them. That's what democratic politics is about. We have the kind of political system where we can make it in the interests of our leaders to start thinking differently about their responsibilities. So that's why I focus on democracies. I don't think that Bill Clinton, that if Barack Obama were a fly on the wall here, that it would change very much necessarily. But if the New York Times and CBS News and so on, if they have report after report about what he's not doing, or take any other political leader, then they might start listening. Change the cost-benefit calculus not just for the would-be genocidal leaders, but for the do-nothing prime ministers and presidents of our countries. That's how we have to think about it. Let me just add quickly, which is not my strong point, being quick about this, but we should say that there's been learning. It's not just that the court is great progress, and I think the court, the ICC, its establishment is great progress, and it's right to emphasize that between Nuremberg and the early 90s, there was nothing. And it's a huge change that first the tribunals were set up and now the ICC was set up. But there's also been learning since Rwanda. There's been soul searching. Not that we see that much evidence for it given what's happened in Sudan, but there's been soul searching, and the public perception of duties and obligations has changed in the Western world. Elite perceptions have changed. Leadership perceptions and thoughts have changed. It's not clear it will lead immediately to action, but there's progress. Learning does take place. And we should encourage and facilitate it. Why can a state, how and why can I say a state can intervene without having other states help? Well, look, the reality is the most intervention in the world is going to be done by the United States, or the United States spearheading it. This is the reality of the international system. Whether you like the United States or not, whether you're suspicious of it or not, if you want power projected in Africa or in parts of Asia or in Latin America or wherever eliminations of assaults take place, the United States is the only game in town. And that's why, in fact, a reason to be hopeful, if you think if you think this would be a reason to be hopeful, because the President of the United States has the power to change things overnight, literally overnight. So if you were President of the United States, you could change things overnight for the good. And maybe the next president, or maybe even this president, will do so. And my response to all of these arguments about how can you say one state can do it without the cooperation of other states, how can you say they can do it here and not there, is let's save lives where we can. And I'm willing to worry about the consequences of doing so, the spillover, the bad consequences. Maybe you're not, and we can have a discussion about that, and we can try to figure out when it's appropriate and not. But as I said, just to repeat it, the historical record is that we've done too little or nothing at all, and not too much, to save the defenseless people who are being cut up, bludgeoned to death, shot, mowed down, starved to death. And so I'm willing to take the risk.
Yes, Jörg Lindmann, do you want to go next?
Yes, please. Maybe just for the fourth question, actually, that was asked, the victims that are at the same time perpetrators. That's a very important question, and I think there's no easy answer to that. There is, in fact, an arrest warrant outstanding of the ICC in the situation of Uganda against one of the LRA, who is supposedly, I don't have any more information than what's on the internet, but if that's true, then that person is himself a soldier, has been recruited to the LRA at a very, very early age, and has then become one of the most brutal leaders of the LRA. I think the challenge will be to sort out the roles and the responsibilities of that person within the organization, and then the question of the child soldier, that is a mitigating factor for me that would have to be taken into account when the sanction is pronounced. But I think just simply not to prosecute a person because he was a child soldier would not give the kind of answers that you would want to see how the system functions, how the crimes are effectively committed. I think in general, the factor of tribunals, be they national or hybrid or international, is very much, the importance or the relevance of those tribunals is very much to see how those crimes have been committed, how it worked institutionally, the lines of commands, and therefore both the victims find themselves somehow taken seriously, but also the perpetrators, because they have to live also, I mean, the victims have to live next door to the perpetrators after all, but also the perpetrators have to live on next door to the victims. And the guilt that you have upon yourself may also be maybe enormous if you're low-key perpetrators, like some of those that we have seen in Rwanda. And if you ever want to have a chance to bring those parts of society together, then both have to understand their roles. Also, the perpetrator has to understand why he committed those crimes. Otherwise, he will resort to continue to give the guilt to the victims and re-victimize the victims, and it will start all over again 20 years later.
Thank you, Christian?
Yeah, just a few observations on what was said about the lack of consistency in implementation of responsibility to protect. Well, there is some inconsistency. The emphasis should be, in any event, on prevention and deterrence. And I think governments have, first of all, an important task in prevailing upon governments which engage in genocidal practices to tell them in very clear terms that they reject that they demand that such practices be stopped. Sometimes this is not done, you know. Governments very often shy away from using such clear words. But if words, you know, are not sufficient, then the question arises, but who should do it? You know, we normally say, well, the international community has a responsibility, but who does it? Daniel just said a moment ago that it is mostly the United States which is often criticized, but which does something, you know. Whereas in Germany, whereas normally, you know, the process of soul searching would begin, and Africa, my God, should we send soldiers to Africa? Never, no, because we are in a specific state of mind still 60 years after World War II. We are not prepared to assume global responsibility. That is something which the people is not able to grasp, that it has such a universal and a worldwide responsibility also. And therefore, you know, it's very costly to do such an action. It costs money. It may cost human lives. Can we intervene everywhere in the world? Our resources are limited, and sometimes the costs to be taken into account are much higher than any benefit which one may expect from an intervention. So when one cannot really say that there must be consistent implementation in each and every case where you observe some major atrocities going on in the country. It is very difficult, and a responsible government, it has, of course, worldwide responsibilities, but it has also responsibilities towards its own people. And the people does not accept everything which might be in the logic of a coherent foreign policy.
Thank you, Christian. Nicola, and then Daniel has the last word, and then we go for drinks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a short word about the child soldiers issue, because it's a very sensitive one. In fact, Ambassador Lindemann wonderfully answered the question based on the Rome Statute and children, I mean, over the age of 18. Now, one place where the issue was particularly awful was Sierra Leone, where you had, of course, much younger child soldiers. And so there it's interesting to see how in the statute of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the situation of children aged between 15 and 18 is dealt with. So I simply read the provision and then I leave it at that. So it's Article 7 of the statute of the Special Court of Sierra Leone. The Special Court shall have no jurisdiction over any person who was under the age of 15 at the time of the alleged commission of the crime. Should any person who was at the time of the alleged commission of the crime between 15 and 18 years of age come before the court, he or she shall be treated with dignity and a sense of worth, taking into account his or her young age and the desirability of promoting his or her rehabilitation, reintegration into, and assumption of a constructive role in society, and in accordance with international human rights standards, in particular the rights of the child. And then the issue of the sentence, the type of measure to be taken against the children. In the disposition of a case against a juvenile offender, the Special Court shall order any of the following: care, guidance, and supervision orders, community service orders, counseling, foster care, correctional, educational, and vocational training programs, approved schools, and, as appropriate, any programs of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or programs of child protection agencies. So no prison, only in kind of educational support reintegration measures.
Thank you for this information. So, Daniel.
Well, thank you. I would like to thank all of you again for coming, to thank the panelists for their thoughtful and kind and generous and very constructive remarks. And we're all grappling with complicated and difficult issues to which there really are no easy answers. And so I would like to thank them and applaud them not only for being here, and that's really not the main reason, but for the work that they do in their institutions to actually try to further these issues. I mean, they're out there working hard, fighting the good fight that is necessary to fight, and it's quite thankless, but it is critically important. And I would like to thank Anne, who is also too modest, sitting here and not contributing to the discussion, because I know she has a lot to say about many of these issues. And so I hope that you all have an opportunity, I know some of you do, to hear her in the future saying what she thinks and what she has to offer, which is quite a lot about them. And so I just want to end then with 3 points, and I will here be quick at least on 2 of them. One is I want to highlight something that's been mentioned but not in the whole discussion, which is, well, it was brought up it was brought up, which is sexual violence. And it's treated in the film. I treat it at great length in the book. I have a very long section on sexual violence, and we have to reconceptualize sexual violence as being an integral part of genocide, as being a constituent feature of eliminationism in genocide. It is part of virtually every genocidal assault. It has been barely noticed, barely recognized until Bosnia, and it still has not been theorized. It's now been mentioned. It has now been the prosecutor in the ICC has tried to extend his mandate by including sexual violence as part of it. It's critically important for a whole host of obvious reasons. It's something that those of you who are interested in this area should work on, build up a better legal foundation, a better theoretical foundation, also for us to do the empirical work to uncover what actually has happened. Because it is a purposeful part, a planned part of genocidal elimination assaults to weaken the target people, often to impregnate the women, to shame them, to make mixed breed children, and so on and so forth, in addition to all of the other reasons that men perpetrate this violence upon women. And so it's a big, big, understudied, under-theorized, and under-legally thought, if you can say such a thing, subject. The question about child soldiers, I would radicalize the question. The question is, what do you do in this difficult case? The response is, it's a very difficult case, which it is. How do you treat them? They start off as victims. At some point, they become fully responsible for their actions, and they're just perpetrators, even if they have a horrible background. But I would radicalize the question or the thought, and to say that it's not just justice necessarily fails. We don't know how to deal with this situation, but that justice fails all the time. Because even if you give a just punishment, whatever that means, and you provide restitution, whatever that means, the crime is not undone. Justice is always a failure because it doesn't prevent the crime. It may succeed in preventing the next instance of the crime. And so that's yet another reason to think about, do what we can with justice, but to think that if we're resorting to a justice system, we have already failed. And finally, the other critical prevention mechanism that has not been mentioned here is to create more democracies. Yes, regime change, not George Bush style, but regime change. Democratic regimes rarely commit eliminations and genocidal assaults. It doesn't mean it's never happened. The United States actually dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, a genocidal, if you want to call it, an eliminations assault. There have been others, but by and large, it's dictatorial or non-democratic regimes that do this. You want to put an end to genocide and eliminationism, get rid of the dictatorships of the world, which the UN and the international system actually legitimize. Another reason to be critical of the UN. Another reason to think about refashioning the international system. I take your point that it's not just sovereignty, but that the whole system needs to be refashioned to delegitimize those kinds of regimes that systematically violate, not just by eliminating and killing people, but violate the human rights, the political rights, the civil rights of people, which all non-democratic regimes do. If we work, and there are ways to do this, Europe has been very effective, and I'll end on this point. Europe has been very effective. It's a critical point which I don't understand why people in Europe and people around the world don't pay more attention to it. The EU was absolutely critical in transforming Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union into basically a democratic area. Because the European Union and its member states said, you want to be part of the club, you want to be part of the game, you have to be democratic and respect rights. It's not done perfectly in all the countries we know, but if the EU had not done this, does anybody really believe that the Central and Eastern European countries would be as democratic as they are today, as respectful of human rights as they are today? The answer is, it's a rhetorical question. The answer is obviously no. It has been done in Europe. It was done in Latin America when the U.S. changed its policy from supporting dictatorships in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s to requiring the countries to be democratic, for them to have good relations with the U.S. In the 1990s, the region flipped from being overwhelmingly non-democratic to being overwhelmingly democratic. We have the power to do this if we, that is the Western, wealthy, diplomatically and politically powerful countries, would actually turn this into their central cause in international affairs. We could change the world without violence, with incentives, pretty easily. This is the other pillar of genocidal prevention and of really furthering the rights of people around the world. We should think more about how we can do that. I thank all of you.
And I should also say some words of thanks to the panelists who were so kind to come here from far and near and sacrifice their time for this long afternoon. I would like to thank you as participants. Daniel, you ended with a kind of a resignative tone on lawyers, which always come too late. But I still, that despite all the weaknesses and cynicism and tragedy which is involved in the law, that we as lawyers and you as law students and lawyers to become, that you will have a very important task to fulfill, and coming together here and starting to think about it is the first step towards acting also. And with this, I would like to invite you to talk further about the issues over a drink outside.